Hi everyone, my name is Abhiraj Karakapati. Welcome to my YouTube channel Amazing Abhay. Looked completely baffled. In all his 30 years of forging and smelting weapons, he had never encountered something like this before. When he had tried to work on the sword, it felt as if the weapon itself was resisting the forging process. In the end, he had no choice but to quickly melt it down and reforge it, and even then, he barely managed to give it a proper shape. If any ordinary blacksmith had attempted the same thing, they would have ended up with nothing more than a useless lump of metal. Despite everything, even with his 20 years of experience handling knives, Geo-ma could tell that the craftsmanship itself was actually impressive. The specifications of the weapon also matched well with the sword god's blessing. However, the hardness was still stuck at E rank. Even so, the knife still had the potential to become a good weapon. If it was reinforced properly, it could definitely turn into something useful. All Geo-ma needed to do was bring the required reinforcement materials, and Volander would upgrade the weapon without charging any additional fees. Still, Geo-ma wasn't satisfied. With visible frustration, he demanded to know what would happen if the weapon broke again. Volander nervously reassured him that even though it was currently E rank, it had the growth potential of an A rank weapon and could eventually become even stronger. There was also a special material known as Never Fail, which could guarantee that Murasame would become stronger, but that material could only be obtained from demonic beasts ranked at or higher. The problem was that ranked demonic beasts were on the same level as E-ranked demonoids, meaning that going after such material would be no different from asking Geo-ma to fight something like the mermaid again. Risking his life just to reinforce a weapon was absurd, especially when even low-ranked demons could drop usable reinforcement materials. Geo-ma then demanded a promise, and Volander swore on his honor as a blacksmith. But that wasn't the end of it. Geo-ma also insisted that Volander refund at least half the cost of the leftover scrap metal, which was worth around 10 million won. Volander refused, arguing that he had followed Geo-ma's exact instructions when crafting the weapon, and had already agreed not to charge anything for the enhancement process. Geo-ma countered that his B-rank sword had effectively been reduced to scrap, and considering the market value, his demand was completely reasonable. Volander tried to push back, but the sharp glint of the blade and the deadly look in Geo-ma's eyes immediately shut him down. Realizing he had no way out of this situation, Volander attempted to negotiate the refund down to 500, but Geo-ma raised it to 1,000 instead. Even that amount was far too much for Volander, but Geo-ma refused to budge any further. At this point, it was clear that Geo-ma was fully prepared to extract value in other ways, if needed. Faced with the choice between losing money or something far worse, Volander finally gave in and agreed to the price. Geo-ma heads to a lone bench on campus to take another look at his blessing. After obtaining a new weapon, his armament has increased, and additional options have become available. The biggest reason that he hesitated to use the sword god's blessing is because of the excruciating pain, but his new stats have reduced the pain by 1 level. It can be further leveled up, which means that leveling up his pain reduction should be his biggest priority. He tested it earlier, and although the pain is still unbearable, it went from feeling like he was about to die to feeling like he can barely breathe. Still, if just 1 level reduces the pain this much, then constant leveling means that he might one day be able to use the sword god's blessing without pain. It seems like armament increases when he obtains new weapons or enhances them. Now that the midterms are over, weapon enhancement should be his top priority to increase his levels. If he keeps growing at this rate, then he might finally be able to understand this power, or maybe he'll even figure out who threw him into this world. As he's eating lunch on the bench, someone sneaks up on him, causing him to startle out of his thoughts. It's Chloe, and it looks like her healing is going along smoothly. She even took off her cast, and Geo-ma asks her if her body is alright now. She still needs crutches to move around, but she already feels stronger than before. As they are talking, Geo-ma notices a crumb of rice on her face and reaches over to clean it. Oh, the brief contact is enough to cause her to fall over from pure joy, but from the ground, she notices the Murasame on the bench that Geo-ma was sitting on. This is the first weapon she has seen him with. That isn't just some kind of kitchen utensil. So, it's a pretty big deal. He's still bothered by the fact that it's E rank, and although he got some money back from the blacksmith, he still needs to gather enough materials to enhance the weapon before it can become usable. There's no real reason for Geoma to get stronger. Ever since he cut down the mermaid, he has been able to handle mid-tier magical beasts. The main reason he wants to enhance the weapon is to reduce the pain. Chloe mistakes his thoughtful expression as him being disappointed by her mentioning that the weapon is E rank. She immediately decides through perfectly reasonable Yander logic that the blacksmith that made Geoma sad must die. Geoma snaps her out of it, but also notices that someone or something is watching them from close by. He walks over to a nearby tree and kicks it hard, causing an unexpected guest to fall down from it. It's Nox's editor, Chloe's brother, and he doesn't seem very happy that he was found. Chloe is prickly about him suddenly appearing, but Geoma can't smell any blood on him, and he doesn't seem to be armed either. However, he was following them, so there must be something that he wants, but Nox quickly clarifies that he isn't there for the usual murderous reasons. He came to warn Geoma that the Academy elders have requested for the editor family to get rid of him. Chloe confronts Nox and asks if that's why Nox came over, but he doesn't respond. Instead, he tells her that since she has been away from home for a long time, she has lost her edge. Chloe doesn't listen, and instead tells Geoma to get behind her so she can protect him. The two guys watch the slightly disabled girl desperately swipe at Nox from far away before Nox continues his warning. Nox doesn't care what Geoma has been up to recently, but the elders are oddly fixated on him. It's not just him either, but the whole auditory family has a sense of unease, so they have temporarily postponed the request. They made the request in secret, and even bypassed the academy head. However, since it's a direct order from the elders, it's hard to ignore. If the pressure continues, the family will have no choice but to investigate our MC. Regardless of the reason, since Chloe is a member of the auditor, Nox felt like she needed to know this as well. That explains his motives clearly. He came under the pretext of family principles, but in the end, he was just worried about Chloe, with nothing else left to say. Nox turns to leave, but Geoma stops him for a moment. He wants to ask Nox about what he said last time about Chloe becoming weak while being with Geoma, but the red-haired older student turns around and continues to walk away. Even he can tell that Chloe is happiest by Geoma's side, and he decides to leave it like that. Even Chloe has never seen her brother act like this before. Before he leaves, he just tells Geoma to make sure that Chloe doesn't get hurt anymore. Geoma doesn't immediately understand, which only angers Nox more. Then Nox takes the opportunity to ask Geoma directly how he became so strong. Geoma seems surprised that he is considered strong. For someone to be strong in his opinion, then he should have the ability to withstand any threats at all times. Like the Sword Emperor, someone like Geoma, who can only maintain that level of strength for less than a minute a day, isn't a level where he can boast about his strength or even talk about it. Nox used Chloe as an excuse to reveal family secrets to him, an outsider, so there's no way Geoma can trust him to keep his mouth shut, so he decides to pick something to satisfy Nox. He tells the redhead that he lacks desperation. No matter how much of a skilled Nox is, there's a vibe that comes from someone who has real world experience. If he stays cooped up in the academy, then he will reach his growth limit, so he has to go out first and gain real world experience. If he continues working hard, then he will definitely gain something. That's about as much rubbish Geoma can spew out without sounding like he's lying through his teeth. So he quickly gets up and walks away before Nox can ask any more questions. Back in class, the students were being taught about history and the nature of blessings. However, Geoma wasn't paying attention to the lecture at all, as his thoughts were completely occupied with the information that the Academy elders were targeting him. The elders of the Academy were descendants of 5 of Ballard Joquin's 7 disciples, a group that held immense influence not only within the Academy, but across the entire world. In the game, their role had always been to interfere with the protagonist for the sake of maintaining their own power and security, which was why players referred to them as the corrupt remnants. That was exactly what didn't make sense to Geoma. They were supposed to be targeting the main character, so why had their attention suddenly shifted toward him instead? He began writing down possible reasons that could explain why they would go after him. When he reviewed everything he had done since enrolling in the academy, he realized that he had indeed caused quite a bit of disruption. At this point, it almost felt like he was deliberately trying to stand out, even though that wasn't his intention. Still, none of his actions seemed significant enough to justify being targeted by the elders. One particular event stood out in his mind: the demonic mermaid he had fought on Scopulia Island. It was clear that the mermaid hadn't been targeting him at all, but rather Leon, who had been seen as an obstacle. Even though Medea had done her best to keep the entire incident hidden, the fact that Gioma had defeated the mermaid must have still reached the ears of the highest-ranking figures in noble society. And since the attack had been directed at Leon, who was considered a candidate for the hero, it implied something far more dangerous. It meant that someone among the elders, or possibly all of them, were collaborating with the demons. They hadn't just tried to interfere with Leon either. They had attempted to kill him. Also, before we move ahead, please take a second to like on this video. A like tells me that you enjoyed this topic. Your support helps Amazing Pi grow naturally. This pointed to the fact that they were willing to sacrifice both the Academy and humanity itself, just to preserve their own authority. The entire situation was completely rotten to the core. Gioma knew that he could storm into the elders' chambers right now and cut them all down without hesitation. But he also understood that it wasn't the right time to act yet. However, when the time comes, Gioma will definitely cut them all down. With this new information in hand, Gioma's decision to head into a dungeon to obtain weapon enhancement materials became completely solid. The first thing he needed to do was form a party, since taking on something like this alone would be far too difficult. Chloe would definitely be willing to help him, but he still needed more members. Instead of someone like Rachel, who relied purely on brute strength, he wanted someone more strategic. The first person who came to mind was Speed Weapon. As soon as class ended, he went straight to the dragon class to find him. The moment he arrived, he was immediately confronted by a brute who clearly had an issue with Gioma being a special student. From the way he carried himself, Gioma could instantly tell this guy was just a third-rate extra, the exact type of person who would be annoying to deal with. Not wanting to waste time, Gioma simply walked past him, giving a warning for the wannabe bully not to bother him unless he wanted his jaw sliced open. That only provoked the brute further, and he pulled back his fist, ready to throw a punch. From Gioma's perspective, the attack was painfully slow. However, before he could even react, someone else stepped in and landed a punch straight into the brute's jaw, knocking him back. The sudden commotion drew the attention of nearby students, while Speed Weapon casually shook his hand, wincing slightly from hitting such a hard jaw. Gioma had heard of strength-based mages before, but seeing a strength-based healer was definitely something new. Speed Weapon then smiled and asked if Gioma had come looking for him. Gioma suggested they talk outside, and once they were alone, he explained everything he needed. In short, he wanted to form a party as soon as possible and needed help gathering members. If they worked together, any rewards from clearing the dungeon would be shared among the team, but in return, Gioma wanted to keep the materials dropped by the magical beasts. The main reason he needed help was because, in his own class, if he tried to recruit people, no one except Chloe would join him. But if Speed Weapon helped, the process would become much easier. Speed Weapon commented that if not for the Academy's rules, Gioma should easily be able to clear 5 or 6 dungeons by himself. That might have been true if Gioma could handle the effects of his blessing without relying on his magical painkiller. But in reality, he admitted that he couldn't even clear a single dungeon alone. Speed Weapon didn't believe that at all and assumed Gioma was just being modest. The conversation briefly shifted into casual chatter, with Speed Weapon mentioning that Gioma looked much better now after everything that happened during the midterms. After a bit of small talk, Speed Weapon agreed to join him, seeing no reason to refuse, and feeling that working with Gioma would be an interesting experience. The dungeon Gioma had in mind was a C-ranked dungeon known as the Buffalo Dungeon, located in Shale 1, with Gioma, Chloe, and Speed Weapon. They now had a party of 3, meaning they only needed 1 more member. Gioma immediately made it clear that he would prefer not to include Rachel or Leon, though in any case, they likely wouldn't be interested. Rachel had gone into seclusion ever since Gioma was hospitalized and had been focusing on training at the academy grounds. Leon, meanwhile, was busy preparing for upper-grade dungeon raids alongside third-year students. While that worked in Gioma's favor, it still left the final team member undecided. Speed Weapon said that one person did come to mind, but considering their habits, they were probably asleep already. Hearing that left Gioma confused, especially since it was still the middle of the day. However, Speed Weapon acted like it was completely normal and explained that this was just how that person usually behaved. He then told Gioma that he would introduce them, but before that, they needed to stop by a convenience store to pick something up. Later that night, they headed toward a place that looked like an old, luxurious house. The building had a clear, Japanese-style design, and Gioma had no idea that the academy even had something like this. Even during his time playing the Miracle's Blessing game, he had never come across this location. In his previous life, he had worked as a Japanese cuisine chef, yet ironically, he had never actually visited Japan, even though it had always been something he wanted to do. They walked through the courtyard and eventually reached the back, where they found the persons Speed Weapon had been talking about. Just as he had predicted, she was fast asleep. He walked up and tried to wake her, but it clearly wasn't working at all. So instead, he leaned closer and whispered something into her ear, saying that he had brought it. Gioma had no idea what it was, but whatever it was, it instantly woke her up. Right after that, Speed Weapon pointed at Gioma and told her that what she wanted was with him. Without wasting even a second, she dashed straight toward Gioma and snatched the bag from his hand. The speed she used to grab it caused her to spin mid-air before landing right on top of him. Gioma was left completely stunned as the girl lay on his chest, casually eating the treats that he and Speed Weapon had bought from the convenience store. While he was still trying to process what had just happened, she asked him, without even moving from his chest, if he had any more yonggang, the Korean dessert made from bean paste. Hearing that word triggered a memory from Gioma's past life. Back then, after living a life consumed entirely by work, the Miracle's Blessing game had been his escape from a world surrounded by men. Like any gacha addict, he had spent a ridiculous amount of money sitting there full of hope, praying that his favorite heroine would end up on his side. The one who made him empty his wallet was none other than Abel von Nibelung, and just like most gacha addicts, he had been deeply disappointed when he realized she would never truly side with him and would more likely treat him coldly. Instead, a standard yet equally rare character had appeared on his screen, asking him if he had any yonggang. Her name was Saki Ryozo, and despite her stunning appearance, it only reinforced his belief that gacha games were a scam. The Miracle's Blessing game revolved around the protagonist Leon, and featured multiple heroines, with Abel von Nibelung, who was officially recognized by the developers as the main heroine. Each heroine had her own charm and abilities, but the central story focused on Leon and Abel overcoming hardships together and developing their relationship. Even Gioma, in his previous life, as someone addicted to spending money on gacha, had been completely drawn in by Abel's charm, pouring a huge amount of money into trying to obtain her. Because of that, the other heroines gradually became less important to him. Among them, the one who faded from his attention the fastest was actually the very first 5-star character he had obtained. And just like back then, she had now suddenly appeared in front of him, standing in front of him and asking for her favorite snack. When he didn't respond immediately, Ryozo turned away in disappointment and called him foolish. Despite her lazy and carefree demeanor, Ryozo was actually the top-tier DPS among ranged attackers. She was also a skill-based character, completely different from Leon. On top of that, since she barely influenced the main storyline, her joining the party wouldn't disrupt anything. From Gioma's perspective, recruiting her should be completely fine. Meanwhile, Speed Weapon nervously held up another piece of candy, which she immediately snatched from his hand before telling him to just say what he wanted from her. Getting straight to the point, Speed Weapon explained that Gioma had approached him earlier that afternoon and was trying to form a party for a Buffalo Dungeon raid scheduled for the following week. Ryozo looked at Gioma curiously for a moment, then walked up to him and asked if he was the one who had fought the upperclassmen during the subspace training. Gioma didn't answer right away, and the two of them locked eyes briefly before she turned away. Since dungeon performance directly affected their grades, there wasn't really a reason for her to refuse, but from her perspective, Gioma lacked the kind of determination she wanted to see. It was somewhat ironic for her to judge someone like that while she was still half asleep, but she made it clear that she didn't want to work with someone who seemed so unmotivated. Speedweapon tried to defend Gyo-ma by bringing up the fight that had happened recently, but Ryoso still wasn't convinced. At one point, Speedweapon almost let slip what had happened during the midterms with the mermaid, but he quickly caught himself before she could get curious about it. Instead, he turned the conversation around and pointed out how she herself was mindlessly obsessed with Yonggang. Gyo-ma simply watched the two of them argue, unimpressed. In his view, a party member could be greedy or rude, but not both at the same time. There was no reason for him to waste his time trying to convince her. He turned around and called for Speedweapon to follow him, deciding that they didn't need someone with such an uncooperative attitude dragging the team down. At that moment, Ryoso coldly questioned whether the dungeon raid really meant so little to him, leading to another brief stare down between them. Then, without any warning, Gyo-ma pulled out a knife. Before we move ahead, please take a second to share on this video. Sharing helps this video reach friends who may also enjoy anime, gaming, travel, cricket, chess, career basics, or personal stories. Your support helps Amazing Abhai grow naturally. Hidden at his waist, and threw it toward one of her archery targets, without even looking. The blade struck perfectly at the center. Before Ryoso could even react, he threw another knife, which hit the first one precisely at its handle. Seeing that, Ryoso dropped down in shock, and Gyo-ma simply asked her if she was interested in joining their party now. The next day, Ryoso was already waiting in their meeting room before anyone else arrived. She greeted Speedweapon and Chloe as they walked in first, and then, a bit nervously, she greeted Gyo-ma when he took his seat. Without wasting time, they moved straight to the main topic. The permits for clearing the dungeon had already been prepared, so now it was time to discuss their approach. Speedweapon stepped forward and began explaining the dungeon details. The Buffalo Dungeon contains C-ranked demonoid buffaloes, commonly referred to as water buffaloes. These creatures were known for charging from a distance before engaging in close combat. However, they had a clear weakness against ranged attacks. Overall, it was considered a straightforward dungeon to clear, but the Academy enforced one strict rule for any students attempting it. They must never open the stone gate located at the center. There were rumors that the gate had some kind of seal placed on it, though that remained unconfirmed. The Academy's permit also explicitly required that the gate remain closed, giving them no reason to disobey. Gyo-ma agreed that they should never open it, though the nervous tone in his voice hinted that he knew more than he was letting on. Ryoso immediately picked up on that and asked if he knew what was behind the gate. He lied, saying he didn't know and that they shouldn't touch it. In reality, he was fully aware that a hidden boss was sealed behind that door and that it could only be opened under specific conditions. For now, the system itself kept it locked. Setting aside the risks of accidentally opening it, the potential efficiency was unmatched. He shifted his attention to Ryoso, who was happily eating another piece of yonggang. She clearly loved that snack, and when questioned, she casually justified it by saying that the brain needed sugar. As the conversation continued, Gyo-ma sensed something ominous in the atmosphere. That feeling was separate from Chloe, who looked ready to kill any girl that even glanced in Gyo-ma's direction. But Gyo-ma knew that whatever he was sensing would definitely show itself when the time came. Later that same day, they set off toward Kimjoldo, Cherwon, where the dungeon was located. When Gyo-ma had been discharged from the army, he had sworn never to return to that city. Yet now he was willingly leading a group back there. Their bus came to a stop at a checkpoint, where the driver had to inform the armed guards that they were students from Jokwon Academy. It became clear that civilian access to the dungeon zone was restricted. Back in the meeting room, Gyo-ma had already felt like the Academy elders were watching him, and now he couldn't shake the feeling that something bad might come out of this trip. Speedweapon snapped him out of his thoughts by offering him some eggs. Gyo-ma refused, and Speedweapon jokingly asked if he was getting nervous over a mere C-ranked dungeon. He then offered some to Ryoso, but she immediately declined. She continued staring out the window, not really paying attention to the group, though for a brief moment, Gyo-ma felt her gaze shift toward him. Between the elders and his teammates, it felt like everyone had their eyes on him. Eventually, the bus arrived at a place where ancient demons had once nested. Though now it had been reduced to a simple farming dungeon, Speedweapon noticed the amount of luggage Gyo-ma had brought and asked about it, only to find out that it was filled entirely with kitchen knives. As they approached the dungeon, Chloe stepped forward to take point as usual, and the group confidently moved ahead. Just like at the border, the guard stationed at the dungeon entrance verified that they were from Jokwin Academy and had them sign a visitor log. One of the guards seemed particularly interested as he watched Geoma write his name. Before the man could say anything, Speedweapon called Geoma over, and the large mechanical door opened to let them inside. As the door shut behind them, Geoma glanced back one last time and noticed the guard still watching from outside. Inside, the dungeon walls were covered with small signatures and drawings left behind by previous students, giving the place an oddly tourist-like atmosphere, rather than that of a dangerous dungeon. Suddenly, he felt someone tug on his arm. Turning around, he saw Ryozo looking exhausted and out of breath. She asked if he had something sweet to help her feel better, and Geoma reached into his pocket to give her a piece of candy. However, candy wasn't what she wanted, and she specifically asked if he had any yongang. Geoma, clearly not interested in babysitting her, told her to bring her own next time, but she'd insisted she was saving hers for later. Before their conversation could continue, Chloe spotted monsters charging toward them from about 200 meters away. Speedweapon immediately turned to confirm that everyone would stick to the plan. He prepared to buff the attackers, while Ryozo and Chloe readied their weapons. Geoma noticed that Ryozo was wielding an S-grade weapon known as the Crimson Bow. With a weapon like that, clearing the dungeon should have been easy for them. The real question, however, was whether he could trust Ryozo to perform properly, especially when she casually took another bite of her favorite snack just moments before the monsters reached them. The monsters came charging straight through the dungeon cave, and Chloe didn't hesitate for even a second as she rushed toward them with dual crossbows in her hands. She leaped into the air and fired 2 shots, mid-jump, landing both directly into the eyes of 2 buffaloes. Those 2 immediately fell back, but the rest didn't stop and kept rushing forward, passing right by their fallen allies as they continued their charge toward Chloe. Without slowing down, she reached behind her and pulled out a sword, preparing to continue the fight, just as Speedweapon called out to her to fall back. Before Chloe could act on that, Ryozo moved faster. She fired 3 arrows in rapid succession, each one striking a target perfectly, taking down 3 buffaloes before they could even reach Chloe. Geoma couldn't help but feel impressed by her skill, but at the same time, he was more worried about the fact that she might break the horns he needed for weapon enhancement. Even so, regardless of how reckless her power might seem, a carry was still a carry, and Ryozo was clearly a high-level DPS who was difficult to stop. As they moved deeper into the dungeon, one of the buffaloes that hadn't completely died suddenly got back up and charged straight toward Ryozo. Before she could react, she turned quickly to deal with it, but her foot caught on a rock, causing her to lose balance and start falling. With no way to defend herself in time, she dropped to the ground and instinctively took a defensive position. Fortunately, Geoma arrived at the last possible moment, catching her as she fell and cutting down the charging monster before it could reach her. Ryozo stared at him in shock while he held her above the ground, and her mix of surprise and excitement slipped out in the form of a small cute hiccup. At the same time, outside the dungeon, the same man who had been watching Geoma earlier answered a phone call from someone unknown, hinting that something was being set into motion behind the scenes. Back inside, with most of the monsters already taken care of, Geoma calmly began collecting the buffalo horns he needed for reinforcing his weapon. While he was gathering them, Ryozo walked up behind him and handed him a piece of young gong as a way of thanking him for saving her earlier. He didn't mind accepting it, but the intense yonder aura coming from Chloe right behind him made the situation uncomfortable. Geoma called Chloe over and quietly whispered some instructions to her regarding the guard they had noticed earlier. She'd acknowledged what he said, and the 2 of them continued discussing it briefly. Meanwhile, Speedweapon, noticing how close the 2 seemed, jokingly asked if they were dating. Chloe immediately blushed at the idea of being in a relationship with Geoma, but Geoma smoothly shut that down, pointing out that not every interaction between a man and a woman had to be romantic. Chloe didn't like that response at all and shot him a glare, though she didn't say anything further. Instead, she shifted the topic and questioned why there were so few monsters in the dungeon. No matter how popular a dungeon was, it shouldn't have been this empty. Ryozo agreed. Before we move ahead, please take a second to like on this video. A like tells me that you enjoyed this topic. Your support helps Amazing Pie grow naturally. Noting that the number of buffaloes felt unusually low, and it almost seemed like they were running away from something. That behavior didn't match how buffaloes were supposed to act. Normally, they were docile creatures and people in the surrounding area even used them for farming. Hearing that, Gyoma found it hard to believe that demonic beasts were being used like that. Though he'd admitted that stranger things had happened, there was also something else suspicious about the situation. But Ryozo chose not to mention it, since they still had cell phone signal and could call for help if needed. Things should technically be fine. As they continued moving through the dungeon, Gyoma asked Ryozo how she and Speedweapon had first met. She explained that she had ranked first in the written exams, while Speedweapon had taken second place. He had bragged about it for weeks afterward, which was how they ended up getting to know each other. She also mentioned that she had placed third in the placement tests. Gyoma hadn't expected Speedweapon to be the bragging type, but Speedweapon surprised him by revealing that Rachel was actually his distant cousin, which explained why being loud came naturally to him. Their family connection also clarified why Ryozo, as someone familiar with the game, hadn't known about Speedweapon's ties to the main characters. His family belonged to a branch of the Changsun clan, while Rachel came from the main branch, which was why they at least knew each other. Still, this wasn't the time to dwell on that. Speedweapon reassured Gyoma that he was already living his dream, and if anything, Gyoma was the impressive one in the group, so there was no need to worry about him. He even went as far as to say that Gyoma had the potential to join the 7 heroes, a statement Chloe immediately agreed with. However, Ryozo didn't respond at all. Instead, she quietly walked ahead of the group and declared that she hated the 7 heroes. The others looked at her in confusion, but there was no time to dwell on it. For now, their priority was to work together, clear the dungeon as quickly as possible, and head back. They needed a total of 20 kills for the dungeon to officially count as cleared. As they moved through the area, Gyoma noticed strange claw marks on the walls that looked cursed. Up ahead, Speedweapon and Chloe kept walking, then called out for Gyoma to catch up, since he had been lost in thought. At the same time, outside the dungeon, the guard was still speaking on the phone with the mysterious person on the other end. He confirmed that Gyoma's group should have run into the enraged Buffalo Luz by now, and said that he had followed the instructions exactly. He believed the enraged Buffalo Luz should have already taken care of them by this point, but the person on the other end told him not to get arrogant, and asked whether he would take responsibility if the plan failed. The man had no answer to that. Instructor Kim simply told him to call back once he had results. After the call ended, the man looked into the open dungeon doors. Either way, he was dead, so he figured he might as well go inside and confirm everything with his own eyes. He had even forced the gate open himself, to make sure their chances of surviving the dungeon would be 0. But when he thought back to Gyoma's eyes, it almost felt as if that teenager could see through everything, and that thought kept bothering him as he walked into the dungeon to check the damage. Back inside, Chloe warned the group that more magical beasts were approaching from behind them. Thanks to her blessing, she could sense around 50 of them running in their direction. Then, all of a sudden, the ground around them began to shake as a stampede of Buffalo Luz charged straight toward them. There were far too many, and it was hard to believe these were even Buffalo Luz. They were supposed to be harmless, but this herd was clearly being agitated by something. In that moment, Gyoma was reminded of something his mentor once told him. Every blade has its purpose. You cannot use a chicken knife to kill an ox, and sashimi knives are meant for fish, but Gyoma had once asked about beef sashimi, which would basically be the same as using a sashimi knife to butcher an ox. His mentor had raised his knife at that moment, making Gyoma think he was about to get hit. But instead, the man simply smiled, while looking down at the fish he had just cut, and admitted that Gyoma did have a point. Somehow, that old memory surfaced now, and Gyoma realized that he was about to use a fish knife to slice cows. With no time to waste, Gyoma immediately began giving orders to the group. He told Chloe to distract the herd without charging directly into it. What he needed from her was to break up their formation without actually attacking them. Then he looked at Weapon with a smile and asked if he was ready. Weapon instantly understood that Gyoma was about to pull off another miracle, and returned the smile, saying he had been born ready for a moment like this. Ryuzo, who who still was not used to Jioma's absurd amount of raw plot armor, could not understand why both of them were acting so calm in front of this situation. Then Jioma called out to her and told her to lock down the front and stop anything that managed to get close. She agreed, shakily, then turned to Weapon and asked why Jioma seemed so calm. Speed. Weapon simply told her not to be too shocked when she saw what was about to happen next. A herd of 50 buffaloes was still a herd of 50 buffaloes, and that was exactly why Jioma had prepared an entire arsenal of sashimi knives. One of the nearest buffaloes finally reached the group, and Jioma threw his knives at it like they were throwing knives. In only a matter of moments, all 50 buffaloes were turned into nothing but chunks of meat beneath Jioma. Ryuzo was so stunned that she even dropped her yonglong. Everything had happened in an instant. Chloe had rushed in using her feline blessing, striking some of the enraged buffaloes while dodging the others, which created the perfect opening for Jioma. Then Jioma himself jumped in with his throwing knives, slicing through dozens of them, without stopping. But then the roar of one of the buffaloes made him stagger and freeze for a moment. The remaining buffaloes took that chance and piled onto him. At one point, Ryuzo actually began to worry, thinking Jioma might be getting overwhelmed under the sheer number of beasts on top of him. But in the very next instant, the mass of buffaloes covering him exploded away in flying slices of flesh, and when it was over, the only ones left standing were Jioma and his team. After putting on that unbelievable display of skill, Jioma simply sheathed his knife and began gathering all the horns into his bag to use later. Thanks to his painless blessing lasting 40 seconds now, cutting down the buffaloes had been easy work. As Chloe walked over to congratulate him on another job well done, Jioma remembered that he would not have been able to pull this off without the help of his party. While they talked casually, Ryuzo kept staring at Jioma in complete shock. Speedweapon told her that she should not be this surprised since he had already warned her about Jioma's skill, though even he admitted that he still could not fully believe what he had just seen. As they looked at Jioma and Chloe standing over the pile of corpses, both Weapon and Ryuzo found themselves wondering what kind of monster Jioma really was. After that, the group resumed moving toward the dungeon entrance. The clear condition for the dungeon had only been 20 buffaloes, yet Jioma had practically soloed enough to clear it twice over. Even then, Jioma still tried to claim that he had not done anything during the midterms. Speedweapon almost brought up his fight with the mermaid to counter that, but then immediately remembered that people were not supposed to know about that incident. Since Ryuzo was right there with them, he quickly changed the subject, and the group kept heading toward the exit. But as they walked, Chloe noticed that the area had become strangely quiet. Soon, they arrived in front of something that looks like a pillar, and Jioma recognized it as the one gate they were absolutely not supposed to open. The group stared at it for a moment, and then, without warning, the gate began to open on its own, while the chains sealing it started breaking apart and falling away. Meanwhile, deeper inside the dungeon, the same guard stood frozen in shock as he stared at the massive pile of buffalo corpses scattered across the corridor. He couldn't comprehend how a group of first-year students had managed to kill that many buffaloes on their own. The only thought running through his head was the crushing weight of his 20 billion won debt from Shia One Land. A few days earlier, a woman claiming to be an instructor from Jokwon Academy had approached him with a proposal. If he followed her instructions, she would erase his debt entirely. Her plan was simple but cruel. She gave him a demon stone and ordered him to use it to control the buffaloes, drive them into a frenzy when Kang Jioma appeared, and finally opened the stone gate deep inside the dungeon to ensure their deaths. At first, he hesitated because it meant sacrificing students, but the temptation of clearing such an enormous debt was too strong to resist. He accepted the stone, already imagining a future free from all his burdens, while the woman told him, "If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to Amazing Apply. Subscribing makes sure you do not miss the next video, and it gives me motivation to keep improving the quality of every upload. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next one."